Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. But notice that when I was walking up the hill here, across the street, there's the production wagons, there's the whole setup complete with latrines. They're doing a shoot over there. How often does this neighborhood have a movie made in it these days?
It's not really that often. I think the only movie where you actually see this this particular street is The Fast and the Furious. It was made about the time that I moved in here. The shots go by really fast in the film. Barely notice them. And then all of a sudden it switches from this street to Elysian Park. Because this street is it's good for chases because it's very hilly. But on the other hand, for a hilly street, it's quite wide. So I think you'd think there'd be more than there actually are.
We're still in Silver Lake, correct? The boundaries are still coming clear in my mind of what neighborhood is which.
Well, the boundaries of neighborhoods are never actually defined by the city. But yes, this is definitely Silver Lake.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Silver Lake here in Los Angeles, speaking with Thom Andersen, professor at Cal Arts, the creator of many films, including, this is probably the one you know best, Los Angeles Plays Itself, which screens here in Los Angeles at least every year, but you've probably seen it elsewhere if you have viewed it. If you don't live in Los Angeles, you've had an opportunity, I'll say that, to view it elsewhere. It's a film about the uses and misuses, representations and misrepresentations of Los Angeles as happens when, like we have across the street here, when a production decides to shoot here. Now, we talked a little about car chases before we started recording, the one in Drive, especially downtown. And does Los Angeles remain a suitable city for cars? Is it still? Are we still in the era of great car chases in Los Angeles, or has that era closed?
Those things come and go like everything else.
Where are we in the cycle, I suppose I should say?
Probably near an end, I think. Drive has a pretty good car chase at the beginning, which is original, so someone will have to come up with something better if they're going to do something else. So that might represent a kind of ending. It's been a long time, really, that we've had these. The modern car chase goes back to the 1970s, right? And many of the supposed classics were set and shot in different cities, like in The French Connection or Bullet. Even though a lot of movies are shot in Los Angeles, there seemed to be a certain amount of difficulty in reproducing those. H.B. Halicki, who created the great car chase of modern movies, and it was set in the South Bay of Los Angeles, said that in order to have a good car chase, you had to have obstacles. So that when he tried to make a sequel that was filmed out in the country, it was very difficult. And that was a film called The Junk Man, which was filmed in the hills around where James Dean was killed. Quentin Tarantino actually tried to prove he was wrong in Death Trap. Some success, I guess.
So you think he may perhaps have proven Halicki wrong?
I think that was his intention in making the movie, to reconceive of an obstacle in a different way.
It is one of the surprises for people, I think, in your film in Los Angeles Plays Itself, to see the original Gone in 60 Seconds by H.B. Halicki and to understand that it does adhere to the reality of the South Bay. I mean, this is a film where you can you can follow the path of the car chases, correct? And you will understand that these car chases follow the roads. You can retrace them, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Why did he succeed where so many failed or didn't try?
Well, he was an amateur filmmaker. He really believed in the aesthetics of the car chase. I mean, at first that film was famous for the duration of the chase, which was the whole second half of the film, about 45 minutes. So a lot of the efforts went into that, and he actually spent a good part of the budget on cars to destroy. He felt that was important. Although it happened that among his other enterprises, he did have an automobile junkyard, so that helped him a bit. Which was also in the South Bay near the Ascot race car track, which isn't there anymore, which was the site for Jack Hill's movie about this figure eight racing, where there's an intersection that the cars have to go through. One of his best movies, I think. So yeah, Halicki had this idea that you could put a lot of stuff in a car chase, and it didn't have to be fast all the time. It could be fast and slow, like the car chase in Drive. So he had a sense of timing that you don't get in chases that just go fast all the time, like the second big chase in Drive. Yeah, so that was a kind of extremism, you might say.
And seeing the neorealist type films toward the end of Los Angeles Plays itself as well, I think people wonder what the ratio is between films that approach the reality of Los Angeles, use the reality of Los Angeles, adhere to the reality of Los Angeles, and the seemingly much vaster group of films that don't care at all about the reality of Los Angeles. What is the ratio there? I mean, is it really a tiny minority, even today, even in the 10 years since Los Angeles Plays itself? Is it a tiny minority of films that bother to find and use the city as it is to inhabit it?
It's not so much that other films miss the reality of Los Angeles. It's just that they're concerned with a fairly small class of people and kind of imagine those as representative of the inhabitants of Los Angeles, or they don't recognize that other people exist.
And the people they focus on are who?
People of immodest means, I guess. I don't know what you'd call them, bourgeois people. Certainly well-educated, articulate people. Quite a number of whom also work in the so-called motion picture industry, which the people who make these films come out of. I mean, there is such a society, I guess. I mean, personally, I'm not a part of it. There are lots of other people who have to struggle, and maybe their lives are shown in some films, but disproportionately few, and quite often these are low budget films, like Aurora Guerrero's film, which hasn't opened here yet, but it did open in New York, and it was a great critical success. The most interesting example of a film about Latino people and people without papers that came from a higher place in the film industry was A Better Life, which I thought was actually quite good. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that, well, it's this guy who's a gardener, and up until the beginning of the film, he's been working for other people. But finally, he has a chance to take over his boss's business. And he needs a truck, of course. So he gets together the money to buy a truck, and his truck gets stolen. So he has to get back the truck. So for most of the film, he becomes a detective. And what I found interesting was that as a detective, he's much more believable than any of the detectives in standard detective films.
What makes him so real?
He actually does some detecting.
Oh, sure.
He really cares about what he's doing. He's not hired by somebody else. Most detective and detective films seem rather feckless, you might say. Harper, Philip Marlowe, the great movie detectives don't do a lot of detecting. Harrison Ford in Blade Runner.
Indeed, I think of The Long Goodbye. I think of Blade Runner. These films that have a presence in Los Angeles plays itself.
Yeah, Harrison Ford complained.
Really?
Yeah, he said, I play a detective who doesn't do any detecting.
Oh yes, that line's there in Los Angeles plays itself sums up a lot of what it seems is the problem with detective movies, to your mind.
Yeah, it's odd, given that some people regard Chandler's novels as discovery of Los Angeles as a subject for fiction and for films. That there's very little presence of Los Angeles in the Marlowe films, except for the final ones. That is Marlowe and The Long Goodbye.
The Long Goodbye seemingly far superior to Marlowe, from what I can tell.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, Marlowe is a kind of unpleasant film, which was something film. Yeah, there were films like that began being made in the late 60s and 70s. That people could take a risk of making a film with unsympathetic characters. Which led to some masterpieces like The Honeymoon Killers or intolerable films like, well, Marlowe, but worse than Marlowe.
You know, I think of a film like Killer of Sheep, which shows up at the end of Los Angeles Plays Itself, the final third, and one which became important to me when it came out on DVD finally. But I notice people I talk to about it often, if they don't come from Los Angeles, or even if they do, they don't realize it takes place there, that it was shot entirely in Watts. I mean, that's some of these films you highlight as real uses of the city. People kind of don't realize that they're even taking place there. Have you found that?
Actually, no, that had never occurred to me.
Really?
Well, I mean, where else could it be?
Right, sure. I mean, there is that, of course, but I've had these conversations where it's like Killer of Sheep, yeah, you know, it's a Los Angeles movie to watch, and people will say, oh, yeah, I guess it is. I guess that is Los Angeles. Perhaps they take it as some sort of platonic West Coast black area. I don't know.
What they used to say about those areas in Los Angeles was, you know, how bad can it be? These people all live in separate detached houses. They're not stuck together in tenements. It looks like a great life. So what's their problem?
Do people say that no longer?
I don't think they say that anymore. No. I think that went out with the uprising in 1965.
And films have grown more fond since of showing the many detached houses that make up the south of Los Angeles, but also the battalions of police helicopters swarming over them. And there's been a certain fetishization in Los Angeles. What would you call them? You know, the sort of Boyz in the Hood type films of the world. How do you categorize those?
I guess I'd just call them gang movies, because there were quite a few of them for a number of years. And I suppose they still appear, although not so much, because I think people realize that it's a misleading representation of those areas. And also maybe the gangs themselves are not so prominent in those areas. Let's say they keep a lower profile.
I do wonder, the cinematic interest, mainstream cinematic interest in Los Angeles right now seems not to be about car chases so much, not to be about gangs, not to be about what else has it been about before? I mean, it seems that I can't point to any specific quality of Los Angeles that films have latched onto. You know, it's not history. It's not a fake history. What is it? What are films looking toward now here?
Well, maybe something like Beginners would be a paradigmatic film of the last decade, or The Kids Are All Right. It's films about basically well-off people who have problems. It's not so much about getting a job as it is about, it's not so much about getting a job for survival as it is about getting a job for self-respect. That's the issue, and The Kids Are All Right. I think for the younger character in Beginners, it's also kind of the same, if I remember.
Can I assume you find more of cinematic value among the parts of society where it is, where the struggle to get a job is about survival, not about self-respect, that there's more to be shown or more that needs to be shown there?
The films about survival tend to be films that show more about the real struggles of society, the real social relations that exist in our society, the issues that need to be addressed in our society, such as why were the problems of the black working class never really addressed? Why were the banks bailed out but not the black working class? Why was the working class in the United States destroyed? Those are maybe questions that are too big for these movies, but at least they come closer to raising them than does a film such as Greenberg.
These are questions that are too big for some of these movies, but are these questions too big for any individual movie? I mean, how much of this can a film hope to take on at one time? How big a question would you expect a film to be able to? If you're speaking of the destruction of a working class, for example, is it too big a question for a film? Must the focus be narrowed?
No, because it can show the details of an actual life, and it can show, let's say, the human potential that exists in people who are basically written off. I mean, you can say that for our society to exist as it does, it's necessary for people to forget the existence of many people who live quite close to them.
I remember a line in Los Angeles Plays Itself about, just an aside about Santa Barbara, the complacent tourist town where the rich don't acknowledge the existence of the poor. And having lived there for 8 years before, I can tell you it hits the mark, certainly.
Yeah, Santa Barbara doesn't have a good reputation in movies. Maybe a little unfair.
But the word complacent, that certainly nails it. I mean, I don't know if that was the first word you thought of to describe the place, but essentially that captures the essence.
Yeah. The definitive movie about Santa Barbara is the one where Edward G. Robinson plays a gangster who decides to retire to Santa Barbara and gets totally fleeced by these social phonies.
Did you recall the name of that film? I can look it up later and put it in the show notes. But it would certainly one anybody who spent time in Santa Barbara would be intrigued to see, I think.
I think it's Little Giant, but I can check.
There's a theme of your film, and something I heard you talk about at the Q&A after the last screening that I saw, which is this idea that reality is more interesting than our imaginations. it's one that resonates with me. Tell me if I've gotten that wrong at all, but is that the right way to put it?
Yeah, that's the right way.
What does that mean to you? I mean, reality is certainly richer than what we can think of, but why do we need to be reminded of it? It seems like we do, but I want to know why.
I mean, I could mention, writers who are more in their imaginations, like, say, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and on the other hand, a writer who's simply trying to record a reality as carefully as possible, like Marcel Proust, and ask which is better. I think the problem is more our imaginations these days are just full of junk.
They've been filled by junk specifically today?
Yeah, well, all the TV we've watched, which people in previous generations didn't have to watch.
What kind of junk have we been filled with by that?
Well, I guess on television, it's particularly the commercials, which certainly offer let's say an image of the world which is quite phantasmal and certainly not useful, and which might lead us to believe that it's, better to have an expensive car, or that if we don't drink the right beer, our masculinity will come into question. Right? I could go on and on. But
our imaginations have suffered.
Mine has, certainly. And I haven't, comparatively, I haven't even watched as much TV as most people. But I came along when TV was just starting, so it did kind of replace a lot in my, a lot of literature and reading that might otherwise have been more useful. Perhaps would have enriched my imagination. But it's more, and then maybe the problem is also that because of this, one's imagination tends to follow, in these kind of rutted tracks. You have certain ideas about how a story should be told and what should be in a story. And this leads to the kind of stories that aren't particularly useful.
Even if our imaginations have been damaged in some way or do get sent onto tracks, we have reality. We can observe reality, and we can always attempt to observe and describe as best we can, even if our imaginations aren't what they used to be, right?
Yeah, certainly. But the richest films are those in which reality is understood, seen, heard in a way that surprises us, right? That is, films where you watch and you say, yeah, of course I've seen that, but I've never seen it in quite that way, or I've never seen it in such detail, or, films that really take you back to reality.
Is Los Angeles, how did you come to realize Los Angeles was a bit of a cinematic battleground for attitudes about reality and usages of reality? It certainly, from watching Los Angeles Plays itself, I always come away with the idea that it is one of the main cities where attitudes compete about how to describe, how and if to make stories out of reality. Do you see it that way as well, that it is a special case, or is it because, as you say in the film, it's your town, and you're acutely aware of these things because it's your town, and because they make movies here?
Obviously, it's a special case. You couldn't exactly make this movie about, many places except, the other places that are either the sites of film industries or because of their touristic possibilities.
Could there be a similar film about like a Toronto, a city that is essentially always used as someplace else?
Yeah, people have proposed it. Toronto, Vancouver. People have even written essays and books about those cities and their relation to film and filming. But you could also do something in, New York. I mean, it's done in Sanders' book. New York, San Francisco, London, Paris, probably Cairo, Mumbai, certain cities, yeah. It could be as interesting.
Has it become over time in your mind? Has it become this idea that seemingly it's okay, or if filmmakers have found it in previous eras okay to disrespect the geography of Los Angeles or the reality of it? Do you think that's going away at all? That sense that it's just Los Angeles, we can sort of treat this however we want. Or are films doing less of that these days?
I don't think so. I mean, there are two ways in which people regard it. There's on the one hand, there are people who think complaining about this is silly. Fictional movies are fictional movies, and one shouldn't concern themselves with, certainly with geographical license. There are also people who do get offended when in the way that movies depict their cities, and even annoys them when they're not literal geographically. I guess I'm kind of a little more with the second group, although I can understand the arguments of the first group. Right. Yeah, I make that argument because I think literalism is well, this isn't a film. Any kind of license is a kind of alibi. A way not to do a kind of work which is important. It's kind of the work of the film that needs to be done. So, I don't like license in biopics, as they're called. In the end, you end up with something like about Ray Charles, where they managed to make events that actually did occur implausible seeming. Oh. So even the stuff that's true seems false.
Everything gets poisoned at a certain point when you've taken enough license. During the moments you're not taking that license in any sense, geographically, biographically, what have you. It's too late. The well is poisoned.
Or a movie like Spike Lee's film about Malcolm X.
Yes.
So there's Spike Lee's film, which is, mythologizing. And then there's, Manning Marable's biography called Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, which tries to get everything right. As much knowledge of his life and death as is possible to discover at this point. Guess what? The Manning Marable's work is a lot more interesting. Because Spike Lee's movie just mythologizes Malcolm X and turns it into this story that isn't particularly interesting and doesn't really care about the positions that Malcolm X actually took in his life. It's basically useless.
I'm reminded of, and this is, of course, a passage that in your film always grabs the attention of new viewers, but the passage about Los Angeles versus LA and the way people refer to the city. And I realized myself the first time I saw this, I'd been using Los Angeles to talk about the city almost exclusively, but LA, the diminutive, to refer to a certain idea of Los Angeles, perhaps a myth. I'd say, well, it's a very LA idea of this place. That's the LA, that phrase represents a lot of myths about Los Angeles to me, but is there interest in what those myths are? I mean, do you find interest in the myths, or are they something that you have to work through, get around to understand, the reality? You get to the Los Angeles, get past the LA, or are the ideas of LA in their own way, sort of a reality that's fascinating to you?
Well, I guess we enjoy myths sometimes. I mean, the myth of the surfer is interesting, but the truth behind it is more interesting, I think. I think it just takes more work to discover the reality that is behind the myth.
More work for a native, more work for an outsider, or more. I want to get the sense of, it's something I didn't want to leave behind before we end. I mean, there's it seems like there's insiders and outsiders that make Los Angeles films. And first, let me establish this. I mean, you said off mic before we began that you've been here in Silver Lake 15 years. How far back do you go with Los Angeles? Where have you lived here? What has been your pathway through this city?
From west to east. But I'm not a native. I moved here when I was 4. And I don't think natives have any advantage in understanding the city. A good example maybe is Chinatown, which was, as we know, written by a native, Robert Towne. But he discovered the story behind Chinatown by reading a book, which anybody could do anywhere in the world. It was Carrie McWilliams' book, Southern California, Country and Island on the Land. Maybe he could imagine that in a certain geography, and it made sense to him in a way that it wouldn't to people from farther away. But the fact is that it didn't come, say, organically from growing up here.
I see. It's, if I think about this divide, some of the filmmakers from Europe that show up in Los Angeles plays itself, and Antonioni. Of course, Zabriskie Point is in there. Jacques Demy, John Borman. What would you say they had advantages, or would you say they just came from a different angle?
Well, both advantages and disadvantages. I mean, if the point of everything is a kind of making strange, as I suggested when I was talking about respect for reality. That is, to show something that's there, but to show it in a different way. The fact that the city is strange to them, that they don't take for granted a lot of things that we take for granted, allows them to see the city in a different and interesting way.
What don't they take for granted, and what might we be?
The geography, the way in which it's different from the cities they know. I think really the best of these films is The Outside Man by Jacques Deray, which hasn't received as much attention as some others because he's not an auteur. He's just a genre director doing these gangster films in France, because he really manages to find a way of photographing just the space of Los Angeles, which is truer than other films. There's a sense of real space, and there's a sense of the way roads pass through the city and buildings are placed upon these roads, and
in a way we can't usually see on screen.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's so.
Do you think this was accidental on his part, or very deliberate in terms of getting it correct?
I think he conceived of that as being a film about Los Angeles. Yeah, simply in the fact that, for example, the credits occur over a helicopter shot of. Not just of Los Angeles, but of the Bunker Hill area, where you can see all of the old buildings destroyed and the beginnings of the new buildings which are being created.
That exact transition point between the neighborhood and the skyscraper cluster we have today.
Yeah. Well, the neighborhood is gone already, but so it's this big kind of big empty lot with a couple of big buildings placed here and there.
Does this, I mean, we talk about the change in Bunker Hill, which is one of the most talked about changes that's happened here, but does this city change too fast for filmmakers to have an enduring take on? Are we always looking at another city when we're watching Los Angeles in an older film, or is the core of Los Angeles you find constant enough that if we're watching it in 1940, 1970, 2000, we're seeing Los Angeles. We shouldn't overstate the changes, or does the shape-shifting nature of this place actually mean that we should think we're seeing previous iterations and keep that in mind when we watch older depictions of Los Angeles?
Well, obviously the changes that have occurred in Los Angeles are nothing compared to the changes that have occurred in cities in China and in South Korea, where there really is a sense of history being destroyed, almost visible, so fast that it's actually visible. The changes that have occurred in Los Angeles aren't so much in the buildings as in the people, the way in which the ethnicity of the city has changed.
As I've heard one writer put it, the world moved in. Is that an accurate description to your mind?
Yeah, sure. Maybe not the whole world yet, but it's getting there. Yeah.
Are films aware? Are they aware of this? I mean, I remember Paul Haggis's film Crash, which of course won that Academy Award in 2005. I remember watching that and thinking it did seem to be strangely disconnected from reality in so many ways, even though one of its prime issues was the diversity and the problems thereof in Los Angeles. But I couldn't help but feel I was watching something that did not have many connections to the reality I knew. What did you think of that film?
Well, it's just a racist film, and racism creates distortions.
It's a racism or racist film. The film is itself racist?
Yeah, it's racist.
Against every race it depicts, or from a particular position?
No, I mean, it varies, I mean, as there are conventions about racism that one has to follow, So, I mean, it's most obviously racist against Koreans, which is more acceptable than other forms of racism now.
So it seems like things hadn't come that far since Joel Schumacher's Falling Down, whose appearance does seem to get a laugh in Los Angeles plays itself. It's also, to your mind, a racist film?
Yeah. I mean, but in a more naive way, I think. That film kind of expresses the confusion that it feels. Whereas Crash is more, it's gone a little beyond that and has, crafted the racism into the plot of the film.
It's a film that perhaps is not confused enough.
Well, I suppose you could say that, but I wouldn't. Yeah, it's just because it's just so, you might say, everything is so overdetermined, and he's quite, he's just quite firm in the position that he's come to take. And sure, there are issues that around race that he doesn't understand or try to understand, really. You might just call it complacent rather than not confused enough.
And finally, the observation you've done about Los Angeles, and whether by the film Los Angeles Plays Itself or everything else you've done, and having been here since the age of 4, I want to get a sense of the best way to keep from being complacent about Los Angeles, about observing it, about watching it, about being fascinated by it and representations of it. I mean, what about Los Angeles now, considering your film has been out 10 years, and You're answering questions at Q&As and from people like me. And what at the moment looks to you like the current source of fascination in Los Angeles, whether aesthetic, intellectual, social, political? What is drawing your attention right now?
I think again, just the struggle of people trying to make a living, especially the new immigrants. Making that possible should be, I think, the chief concern of people who are established here and don't have to worry so much about that.
Can films make it possible? In part,
sure. Everything helps or hinders. I mean, people say a movie or a book doesn't change someone's mind, but and you have to ask, how does a mind get made up in the first place? Except through films and books. Well, and of course through the views of your parents, but certainly the books you read and the films you see help to make up your mind, and they can also quite often really challenge ideas that have become part of your mental makeup. At least make you rethink things, or clarify things, or confuse you.
I've been speaking here in Silver Lake with a very compelling upstairs view of Los Angeles with Thom Andersen, professor at CalArts, filmmaker. And if you have lived in Los Angeles, or if you've been a city enthusiastic filmgoer, you've probably seen his film Los Angeles Plays Itself, which screens at the Arrow in Santa Monica at least once a year. I've seen it a few times already, and I will be seeing it more. And there may be a remaster on the way. Is there anything you can say about that? The possibility of a sort of footage being replaced and things being polished a bit on it. I mean, it's. I would watch it as it is many times, but is there another version in the offing?
Be a little different, and a little better.
Mm-hmm. A little different, a little better. Well, Thom, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on Movies, Paul Doyle, Humberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.